Okay, welcome to week 11. We are going to be looking at the effects of social media and technology in general on human society. Back in the mid 1990s, there was a novel called Neuromancer. And in retrospect, it has proven to be an incredibly insightful look at where we are in 2021. It introduces a hero who lives between two universes. Reality as we know it and the metaverse. Getting into the metaverse, again, when you think about technology in the early 1990s, is as simple as bringing a visor down over his eyes. Sounds just like VR. The point of the novel, in a very indirect way, is that ultimately the hero cannot distinguish between what we know to be the real world and what we typically refer to as the virtual world. This, I would argue, is quickly becoming the most serious problem we face. Let's go back to the beginning of the course. We said that, as outlined by Eric Fromm, there are three types of human societies: life affirmative, life neutral, and life negative. We said life affirmative cultures typically stay low tech. And they stay low tech because the physical universe is benevolent. Life negative cultures develop increasingly sophisticated levels of technology because the universe is inherently hostile. We've also made the point that in life negative cultures, we tend to take a dim view of what it means to be human, and that typically we are constantly dealing with antisocial behavior. In effect, we expect the worst. Seem pretty accurate, John?
I think to our society right now, yeah, we're definitely the life negative culture, as you said earlier this semester.
Okay, so if this is correct, then the other point that we've been making since the beginning is that all technology in some shape or form contains assumptions about what it means to be human.
So what would that be? Would that be like our religions in the modern day world, or just like whatever our core belief is as a human?
Great question. And the answer is that if we take a closer look at life negative cultures, There's some things that we know about them. Number one, it's logic and reason over intuition and emotion. Number two, we know that they are rigidly hierarchical. Number three, we know that they are primarily male-oriented. 4, they are inherently aggressive and warlike.
So are we basing all of this? I know we've already established this before because I remember this from earlier videos, but are we basing this, like, I guess, assumed information off of our existence, meaning we are like male primarily, we are hierarchical, we're aggressive, and we like logic and reasoning?
Yes.
And another question I had, sorry to interrupt this explanation of the question I just had, but I know you're explaining life negative cultures, but you're talking about life positive cultures. And like one of the things I was wondering is is the whole thing around them being a life positive culture that they are able to comprehend like who they are as humans? Would they still have religions, or are we like not able to comprehend that because we're not life affirmative creature? So like we can't really positively understand how a creature that thinks like that would actually think about life.
Okay. Both insightful and very good observations. For example, if we were to contrast a life negative culture with a life affirmative, number one, we know from their myths that they stress the importance of emotion and intuition, which doesn't mean that they have no place for logic and reason. We have a place for intuition and emotion, though we pride ourselves on being logical and rational. They tend to not be hierarchical. They tend not to be male-oriented. And they tend to be not aggressive. So the kinds of aberrant behavior that are part of life negative cultures are not found in life affirmative cultures. And what's more important is that deeper than that is that these are assumptions that we bring to the creation of technology that we never really question. After 60 years of the women's movement, we're still hierarchical and we're still male-oriented. So why should we be surprised that the field of technology is dominated by men? It remains rigidly hierarchical. We talk about artificial intelligence because we have no way of dealing with intuition and emotion. And in fact, we discount intuition and emotion as being female. So our technology reflects not only how we see the world, but how we see ourselves. Does that make sense?
Oh, I got a question. This is Michael,
Yeah.
by the way.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, I was going to ask, so would you say like early hunter-gatherer societies were more life affirmative? Or what societies would you say were more life affirmative?
I think all societies in human history have kind of been life negative. Because if you think about like even like the last remaining non-social human tribes in like, you know, the Amazon or wherever they would be, because there's only like 5 remaining in the world.
Yeah.
They are still like hierarchical, or like you have a chief or whatever. I don't think they would necessarily be as technology driven as like we are as a first world country.
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like they definitely still have that same negative drive that we all go through. I think it's like species. I don't think there is like a species on Earth, considering we're the only sentient one, that would actually be life affirmative.
Well,
I might be wrong. I don't know.
well, I mean, I would just be interested, like, even though these tribes are isolated, does that mean that they haven't had any influence? Like, it's just maybe they're isolated from our sort of like modern civilizations, but there might have been other cultures. For example, I was reading about a culture in a book recently called Language and Power, where they were saying that there was like a culture they found of Native Americans that couldn't express hierarchy right in their language. So anyway, I don't want to distract from the lecture here.
All right, let's go back. Let's first of all draw a distinction between hierarchical and rigidly hierarchical.
Mhm.
Just because a tribe has a chief or has a shaman, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily oppressive.
Mhm.
But what's oppressive about a life negative culture is that the hierarchy itself is oppressive. This is where racism and sexism become inherently a part of the social fabric. And John, in an earlier lecture, one of the points I made was ethics or morality is specific to a particular society. Every society has a foundational myth.
So what you're kind of saying is that it's completely situational between each different society in the world, and that there could be potentially a life affirmative society.
Yes,
within humans?
absolutely.
Interesting.
And before they were essentially exterminated and relegated to tribal reservations, Fromm points out the Icelandic natives, the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Pueblo as all examples of life affirmative cultures. But they have no defense against the inherently aggressive life negative cultures. Second, we don't know what happened here. We don't know why one group of people went negative while another group of people confronted the universe and went 180 degrees the other way. We do know that when we talk about the shape of Western culture, that across all life negative cultures, even the Asian life negative cultures, there are common elements. For example, bullying existed well before the internet. But what's happening is that cyberbullying is worse than bullying in the 1950s. And one of the key elements, which the articles talk about, is that it is even easier for us to depersonalize people and to be depersonalized on Facebook or any other form of social media than it is anywhere else. We will say and do things online we would never do to a person's face. Make sense? Michael, John, make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Yes, makes sense for sure.
Okay. And if you think about the conversation we had last week, we said that since the year 1800, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That there is a growing alienation, specifically in Western culture, because between 1800 and 2021, we have significantly damaged all the basic social structures of human life. And the ones that we specifically looked at in the last class are, number one, the nuclear family, and number two, the extended family. And the result of this is that we live the bulk of our lives alienated. And as a consequence of that, intimacy is a big problem. So we have ended up objectifying and reducing ourselves to a commodity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see who else is here tonight. Hey, Josh, welcome back. Miles, hope you're doing well tonight. All right. Any questions, anyone, before we go on to the next point? Okay. This foundational myth is absolutely critical because it contains the answer to the human question for that society. We define aberrant behavior in terms of that answer to the human question. And similarly, our concept of law, proper social behavior, are tied to the answer to the human question. So what we've essentially done we increase antisocial behavior. And in a strange way, if there are no consequences, we don't experience any need to be responsible. So why not cyberbully? Make sense?
Yep.
And the other point that we made last week, or one of the other points, was this. We're not taking care of our needs. We can't. And therefore, there is no good end. One of the conversations we had 2 weeks ago came down to this. Okay, as I go through this, keep in mind that this is largely still conjecture on my part, okay? Darwin and his contemporaries assumed that the end of human evolution was the nation state. And therefore, all societies that are tribal are primitive. The nation state is the aberration. In fact, the industrialized nation state is the aberration. That's why if you look at what's happening throughout Western culture, the nation state is breaking down, and it's breaking down into a tribe. The only difference between now and 10,000 years ago is that tribes are virtual. And the fundamental reason that this is happening no intimacy and no community. That's why social media is successful. However false or fake or dangerous, it gives us a sense of intimacy and a sense of community. Thoughts, reactions?
So does this kind of like tie into what we were just talking about? I feel like it does, because you're saying that Darwin's whole thing is that if you're a tribe, you are primitive. I don't really know if that just means like technology wise. I guess if he's talking about that, then it would be true. But I think considering you said that he's wrong, it's more talking about the state of mind you have as a human.
Yeah,
Am I correct in saying
Darwin.
that?
Yeah, when Darwin used the word primitive, it was pejorative. It was insulting.
Mm.
So, for example, when 19th century explorers went to Africa and they encountered a Maasai village, which is tribal, they would look at it and go, low tech, no written language, therefore primitive, therefore not fully human, therefore inadequate, insufficient.
Mm. And then enslave them.
Yeah.
Pretty much is what they did.
Yeah. So the point then becomes, if in fact the nation state were natural, especially the industrialized nation state, we wouldn't be having these problems.
What do you mean by a natural nation state?
Okay. If we go back to our initial conversation about Darwin, he argued that the development of human evolution paralleled the development of humans in relationship to other life forms, which means we move from simple to complex. So family, tribe, village, city, city-state, nation-state. The movement from family to nation is triggered by technology. And Darwin would argue that as technology increases, so does consciousness. And in fact, Darwin links human consciousness to the development of the neocortex. He didn't know about the neocortex, but ultimately the argument would be that frontal part of the brain, that is the home of logic and reason, is a late evolutionary development. And while we are not the only organism to have a neocortex, with the exception of one type of dolphin, we have the most complex. What Darwin missed is that as human society becomes more complex, we lose our fundamental identity and we lose our sense of uniqueness. As I like to say, we demythologize ourselves. And with this loss of identity and loss of uniqueness, we actually shred our society. There is no uniqueness in a highly industrialized world. All humans are interchangeable parts in the machine. That is the lesson of Henry Ford. And at the end of the semester, when you read Brave New World, Huxley calls it Fordism. So we're taken away from our family. We're taken away from our tribe. And then we wonder why aberrant behavior surrounding a lack of intimacy, alienation, objectification all occur. We wonder why sex trafficking is a worse problem than it's ever been before. We wonder why self-objectification is a worse problem than it's ever been before. We did it. And it's not a problem that's fixable with AI. So one of the points that we made a couple of weeks ago that the direct result of the Industrial Revolution was a process of alienation. And you may remember the statistics from a previous lecture. In 1800, 84% of the population was self-sufficient, which meant that they lived and died between 5 and 15 miles of where they were born. By 1900, only 41% were. Which meant most of the people were living and dying far away from where they were born. And by 2017, 2%. We said that one of the key dates is 1973, when the phrase latchkey kids was used for the first time. And essentially what happened is that between 1900 and 2017, again, this is review, the Marshall Plan, we rebuilt the world. But we allowed our own infrastructure to fail. It's the end of the golden age in America. We said that during the 1950s, one working adult could support 5 people. This is the move to suburbia. This is summer vacations and travel, and life is good. But in the 1960s, this all collapses. We shift to a consumer-based economy, which is based on service. And both of those together mean that there is a significant decline in our standard of living. So that by the early 1970s, 2 adults have to work to support 4 people. And this doesn't take into consideration the fact that between 1960 and 1970, there's a huge shift to single parent households. So into the mix, we add another mess, which means that all of the necessary roles are going to be broken. So you are the fifth generation. So why are we surprised that you don't know what your gender is? You don't know what your sexuality is. You have no concept of parent. You have parented yourselves. You've been raised in a morally neutral environment called a school. And your only connectivity of any depth is through social media. It's a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly where we are. Technology won't make it better. Technology will make it worse. Why? Because this is a life negative culture. And our technology is life negative. I'll stop there. Questions, comments before we move on?
So you're talking about how as technology increases in a life negative culture, like we would degrade as people. What if technology was increasing in a life affirmative culture? Would they just, how would that work? Or like, how is that theorized to work?
Well, theoretically, you run into a problem that looks like this. Can I erase the screen? Everybody good with this? All right, I'll assume you are.
Yeah.
They don't need high tech.
So they're kind of just accepting their surroundings in the way that they were created, I guess, and they just don't see the need to.
That's right. If
Because
I
we're
get
only
all the
creating technology essentially to fill the hole that like we experience as a life negative culture.
That's right. Absolutely.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So could it be sort of in a sense that you have a life affirmative culture that becomes like extremely technologically advanced, but then sort of becomes a life positive culture? Because I feel like if you had a life positive culture with all the benefits of technology, you'd kind of end up in like a semi-utopian society, correct?
Well, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But we have to make a decision
Mm-hmm.
about what that's going to look like. And for example, listening to the hearings today in Congress, They are not the problem. They are the mirror. So ultimately, what's going to happen is this. And if you look at every social problem for the last 100 years, that is not going to work. Why? Because we are treating the symptom and not the cause. Internet addiction is a problem because we have no family. We have no intimacy. We have no community. We have no connection. Nothing. And I'll go back to what I told you. Humans have needs. We have two choices. We either take care of those needs or they take care of themselves. And when they take care of themselves, no good comes from that. We've talked about this in other lectures. Medicaid and Medicare failed. Universal health care will fail because it's not addressing the problem. It's treating the symptom. In the mid-1960s, the cost of higher education began spiraling out of control. What did we do? We created educational loans. Did it fix the problem? No. The cost of education and the cost of healthcare continues to increase year after year at a rate greater than inflation. So why are we surprised that you walk out of school $100,000 in debt? Because there was no reason for higher education to effectively deliver a product. There's no reason for healthcare to deliver a product cost effectively. And in terms of those articles for this week, why are we surprised that Facebook spreads hate? Why are we surprised we're becoming more polarized? Why are we surprised that I have no patience with you because I only want to hear people who think like me? Why are we surprised that ghosting and canceling are problems? We shouldn't be. We shouldn't. We're 121 years into the Industrial Revolution.
So are you saying
We
like,
still don't get it. Sorry, go ahead.
dang it, I had this really good question that I just slipped out of my mind. Never mind. I'm sorry.
I know. If you think of it, bring it back. So, do you see what I'm saying? Am I making sense? If you disagree, that's
Yes.
fine.
Oh, I don't disagree. I'm just saying you make sense.
Oh, so like you're saying that one of the problems with school costing money is that it's not producing like a product that's like viable. Would the solution to that just being free education? Would that
Well, there
solve
are
the
several
problem, or is that-
problems. Let's look at higher ed for a minute. So, in 1948, when the Marshall Plan is passed, they create the GI Bill. And the GI Bill basically said if you fought in World War II, you go to college for free. So in the early 1960s, colleges were overwhelmed. So what do? They began aggressively building. So by the mid 60s, there's a shift in American culture. Want a better life? Go to college. By the 1970s, you better go to college. By the 1980s, as vocational high schools begin to disappear, so that's what happened. Meanwhile, because the cost of going to college suddenly went up, because colleges were doing a lot of building, the question became, what do we do about this? Well, student loans. Except there was no check. No one said you can't raise tuition 10% a year when the cost of inflation is 3%. We treated the symptom and not the cause. And now we've created a bunch of other problems.
I have a
You
question.
see the point?
I have a question. Can
Yeah.
you hear me? Oh, okay. So first, to clarify, you're saying the problem is the original monetization, or what was the root
It's a
problem?
combination of things, Michael. Number one, rather than deal with the problem of unemployment, when the soldiers came back from World War II, we just sent them to college for free.
Mhm.
Because we sent them to college for free, colleges had to build a lot of new buildings, which meant they went into debt.
Mhm.
Tuition wasn't enough to cover the debt. So they started raising tuition.
Mhm.
When we didn't control the cost of education, we gave everybody educational loans, which allowed the cost of education to keep rising.
Yeah, it's like a devil's cycle, right?
Yeah.
The second part is you say colleges became a little more than vocational schools. So I guess that's kind of the era of college that we're coming up in. But what was college pre that? Like, I guess pre 1980s, 90s. Like, what would a college that was not more than a vocational, a little more than a vocational school look like? What did that curriculum and education system look like?
That's what it was.
Could you elaborate? Like,
Yeah. If you wanted to become a scientist,
Yeah.
you went to college.
Mhm.
You wanted a general liberal education, you went to college, and the assumption was you'd become a teacher.
Yeah.
or you went there and you studied the classics.
Mhm.
That's all.
Okay.
And if you couldn't succeed, you were dumped into the business school. And if you look at most modern universities, the largest, wealthiest part of the university is the business school now, which is all about job training.
Oh,
And then you have sports medicine, sports management, physical therapy, all of which in the 1970s and into the 80s would have been taught at a vocational school,
mhm.
not at a four-year university.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So back to what we're talking about at hand, it comes down to this. Technology has magnified our social problems. And technology will continue to magnify our social problems. Biologically, so again, we shouldn't be surprised that any of this is occurring. That sex trafficking is at an all-time high, that pornography is at an all-time high, that human sexuality has been reduced to a transaction on Tinder. None of it is surprising. So what do you think, John?
It all makes like a lot of sense. It's very interesting to think about how we as humans can like look at this on like I'm looking at this information, I'm learning it actively, and then I still will like I guess because I'm like conforming to society or whatever, but I'm still like a part of this, even though I recognize it and like can try and go against it. But in the end, like we'd all like resort back to the same pattern of requiring intimacy and community and such. It's very interesting why it's like almost an unavoidable cycle that we go through.
Yeah. And part of the problem is that social conditioning in many ways is forcing us to deny our biological needs. We don't even see the impact of social media on our lives. We assume it's natural. And yet depression, suicide, loss of identity, anxiety, eating disorders are through the roof. Problems with sexuality, problems with gender, cyberbullying, internet addiction, pornography addiction. Why are we surprised? No intimacy, no community. We cannot regulate our way out of our problems. We cannot pass laws to fix our problems. We are not going to fix racism and sexism with equal opportunity acts. Allowing people to randomly change their gender is not going to fix the fact that we don't know who we are.
So do you think that this is a problem that is even solvable in our lifetime?
I think it's solvable, but I don't think we're going about solving it the right way.
Because we're not addressing it as we should.
Yeah. Right. I mean, the fundamental problem, I'm not a fan of Sigmund Freud by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the points that Freud made, which bears well for the world in which we're in, he said that ultimately we learn our gender identity from our parents. And that for society to be healthy, we have to have if you grew up in a single parent household, where are you going to learn it? You don't. And so one of the problems that we face is not just the whole gender confusion thing, but toxic sexuality. Particularly so it keeps coming back to the same fundamental point. We have killed family, and we have killed the extended family. Until we find a way to build a society that takes us back, the problems are not going to get better. They're going to get worse.
I hate to leave right in the middle of your point, but it is 9 o'clock now. I really appreciate the conversation
Not a
we had in
problem.
this lecture. Thank you
Welcome
so much.
anytime.
Bye-bye.
Any other questions or thoughts so far? Michael, what do you think?
Nope.
Josh, what do you think?
I'm a bit intrigued to hear your stance on this, the gender identity, because that's very far from what I've seen. Everyone I know who has had a gender identity conflict has had parents who would have loved for them to not be that way in one way, or they weren't very receptive to the change. They'll put it that way. So what did you mean by they get it from their parents?
Well, part of the problem is that over the last 100 years, our concept of gender and our concept of sexuality has become particularly toxic. And when you add to that a society that's essentially broken, we end up in a situation, well, try it this way. This whole self-help industry did not exist before 1950. And this becomes a turning point in the breakdown of the question of identity. And what we're seeing as we continue is that our society is so fractured that we just don't even know who we are anymore, and we spend most of our time trying to figure it out. This is why we have influencers. These are the people who provide us with a sense of identity. And part of what's happening is we think that if we reject the stereotypes, we're somehow going to find our true identity. Well, that doesn't always work. So we end up in this broken feedback loop. And if you think about the point that I've made about diversity repeatedly, is that I only see how you differ from me. And as a consequence of that, we lose a common sense of identity. And this further fuels example. A few years ago, at a different school, at the end of the semester, one of my students came up to me and she said, "You want to know what the tragedy of this is, Falcon?" And I looked at her and I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She said, "You care more about us than our own kind." And I looked at her and I very calmly said, "I am your kind. I'm human." We have become so fragmented that we have no way to speak to each other. And that takes us right back to the point that I've been making this entire lecture. Without intimacy and community, we don't know who we are. We don't know how to behave. We don't know what the world is like. We don't know. And the net result of that is the breakdown of our society. Questions, comments, thoughts? Does this make sense?
Yes. I was going to say two things. So first of all, I think what you said about the self-help industry is kind of interesting, because I've seen some like self-help stuff recently, and a lot of the sort of big books in self-help nowadays seem to be kind of like all about how to like reaffirm sort of traditional masculinity and sort of gender norms and things like that. So I think that's just kind of I guess, and that might tie back together to sort of like a life negative and like toxic culture, as you were saying. And I just think that's sort of an interesting thing. But would you say that these, are you saying that there needs to be a return to sort of traditional gender, like a traditional gender dichotomy, or that we kind of have to move past it?
Well,
Or
I think
something else.
I think in some respects, there's a middle ground in between.
Mhm.
I don't disagree with the concept that in the 1950s, gender identity was incredibly oppressive. It
Mhm.
was. On the other hand, if you have 90 different genders, all bets are off.
Mhm.
You see my point?
Yeah, I understand. So you're not considering gender as like a spectrum necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, how do you have a functional society if you don't, let's take the word gender out of it. How do you have a functional society if you don't have any social roles?
Mhm.
The problem is not the role, the problem is the oppressive nature of the society.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying.
All right. Are there other questions?
Yeah,
All right.
I'd just like to bring this thread back to my question. You've explained how there's a societal breakdown, but like in the parent-child context, that smaller zone of influence, I don't think I think we could talk more about that. Like what the parent-child sphere is what I'm really interested in hearing from you.
Okay. Well, here we have a couple of things to take into account. There's an increasingly interesting field of study called epigenetics. Watson and Crick, and again, we've talked about this before, assumed that essentially your DNA was static. You got it at birth and it stayed that way your entire life. What epigenetics is arguing, and I think at this point fairly conclusively, is that your DNA is dynamic. It's always in the process of change, based in part on environment and based in part on your choices. So, for example, if two humans had 10 children, all 10 would be different. Why are they different? Because at the moment of conception, their parents' genes are different. And part of what's happening trauma is inherited. So if you've been enslaved for 400 plus years, imagine the trauma that you're inheriting. If you're like me and your father was an alcoholic, that's inherited. If we want to begin to fix our society, we've got to address the problem of trauma. And once again, we're not. We treat the symptom, not the cause. Because I was abused, I'm anorexic. Because my father was an alcoholic, I am. That doesn't mean that every abused child is anorexic or every child of an alcoholic is an alcoholic. But in my case, the trauma was significant enough for me to be. Life negative cultures are filled with traumatized humans. We have to stop it. If we go back to what Fromm said, if the idea would be for us to be affirmative, and if we are now negative, the best that we can do is become neutral. And that's going to involve a fundamental change in how we answer the human question. And a big part of that is building a society that minimizes trauma. As I prefer to put it, it has to be human and humane. If it's going to be human and humane, then by definition, it's got to be kind and caring and loving. And it's not. For it to be human and humane, we need intimacy and we need community. And we don't have it. So to bring it back to the fundamental point, all of the problems associated with social media and the internet are going to continue until and unless we fix the underlying problem. Does that help?
Yeah, one final point. This is still very much at societal pointing. But say you had, for lack of a better term, ideal parents, and even if your society overall is very poorly structured or life negative, that sort of microcosm, does that help? Like, are these problems avoided in a micro sense if your immediate caregivers are not following the structure of society?
The answer is it can be. And conversely, if you knew me better, you would hear me say repeatedly, I'm alive because people who had no reason to care did. Starting from when I was 7 years old and nearly bled to death in an accident on a truck farm in Connecticut. The world has changed one act of kindness, one act of love, one act of intimacy, one act of community at a time. One life at a time. How you interact with the world every moment of your life either helps us move away from life negative or continues to keep us mired in life negative. If we don't find a way to provide every human with intimacy and community, if we don't find a way to build a human and a humane world, we're not going to fix these problems. All the regulation in the world, all the laws in the world will not fix the problem. If I didn't think it was possible, I wouldn't be teaching you. All right, any questions before I pause the video and take attendance?
That was all for me.
Okay, I hope you've enjoyed it. Hang on.
Oh, can I talk to you after class just a little bit? Thank you.
All right, let me get this to pause the video.